The Scottsboro Boys Case, a fight for a fair trial. The American South in the early 1900s was a deeply divided place of unimaginable cruelty, where African Americans were dehumanized purely because of the color of their skin. Although slavery was abolished decades earlier, new systems quickly emerged to ensure the oppression of black people. Among these were Jim Crow laws, a form of segregation that brutally punished African Americans for the smallest actions, including eating or drinking with a white person. Many white Southerners perceived these laws as necessary, believing that they preserved the racial hierarchy, and as a result, it was really impossible for African Americans to be treated as equals, especially in the court of law. Minnie Evans, a black artist from the Jim Crow era, explained,
"A colored man cannot get any charge made against a white man here. They take the colored man and send him to the penitentiary, and the law is not executed on the white man at all."
This truth was heartbreakingly evident in the Scottsboro Boys case, where innocent black teenagers faced several trials poisoned by racism. In 1931, an unfair trial occurred in Scottsboro, Alabama, in which 9 African American teenagers, later known as the Scottsboro Boys, were wrongfully convicted of rape due to racial bias in court, violating their 6th and 14th Amendment rights to an impartial jury. The state of Alabama disregarded its responsibility of providing a fair trial, resulting in 2 of the boys' cases reaching the Supreme Court, in Powell v. Alabama and Norris v. Alabama, helping ensure fair trials for future defendants. These pivotal moments, however, resulted from events that unfolded on March 25, 1931, during the height of the Great Depression, when 9 black teenagers boarded a freight train headed to Memphis, Tennessee. The boys hadn't met before this day, and many were traveling in search of work, hoping to better their lives. However, their dreams were quickly shattered when a group of white men started a racially charged altercation with the boys. Because of this, the train was stopped by an angry mob in Payrock, Alabama, where the boys were forcibly removed and arrested. Following this, 2 young, impoverished white women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, falsely accused the Scottsboro Boys of rape. Both women, who were prostitutes, had been riding the train illegally and feared being charged with vagrancy, and as a result, saw the allegation as their only way to divert attention from their own crimes. Clarence Norris, one of the accused, explained,
"I knew if a white woman accused a black man of rape, he was as good as dead. All I could think was I was going to die for something that I had not done."
After the women placed their accusations, the boys faced the trial in Scottsboro, Alabama. They were assigned 2 unqualified lawyers, Balo Moody, who hadn't practiced law in decades, and Stephen Ruddy, who was unfamiliar with Alabama law. Although the Scottsboro Boys were guaranteed the right to legal counsel under the 6th Amendment of the United States Constitution, the representation wasn't required to be qualified or effective. This loophole allowed Alabama to provide an inadequate legal defense, despite this clearly violating the intent of the amendment. Additionally, Alabama selected a jury of exclusively white men, which was guaranteed to be biased due to their racial prejudice, violating the boys' 6th Amendment right to an impartial jury. As Haywood Patterson, a Scottsboro boy, explained,
"The courtroom was one big, smiling white face."
the jury's bias was reflected in their disregard of medical evidence, as Dr. R. Bridges, who inspected the woman for signs of rape, testified that his examination showed little evidence of assault. The racial bias was further exemplified by their ignorance of inconsistent testimonies. One accuser, Price, described extreme violence, and the other, Bates, mentioned little brutality. Despite this, the jury found all 9 Scottsboro boys guilty, sentencing 8 of them to death. This decision wasn't based on evidence, rather it was fueled by the belief that black men are inherently violent and dangerous. However, the problem extended far beyond the jury's prejudice, as Alabama was just as responsible for the injustices that the boys faced. By providing a biased jury, Alabama clearly failed its 14th Amendment responsibility of providing due process. Andy Wright, another Scottsboro boy, wrote in a letter,
"Why am I sitting down, thinking of no one but you, Mama? They didn't give me a fair trial. They are going to kill us for nothing."
The decision caused sharply divided perspectives across the nation, with Southerners defending the verdict and Northerners seeing it as a clear violation of rights. In response to the outcry, two legal organizations, the NAACP and the ILD, were prompted to get involved. Driven by their commitment to civil rights, the ILD persuaded the boys' parents to let them take on the case. They appointed Samuel Leibowitz, a Jewish lawyer from the North, to legally represent the boys. However, he faced significant hate from Southern crowds, with many seeing him as an interfering outsider. Despite this, he was determined to prove the boys' innocence, and he appealed the boys' sentences to the Alabama Supreme Court. The court reluctantly granted another trial, though this new trial remained flawed as the jury's racial bias continued to shine through. Consequently, the ILD appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court once more, but their request was ultimately denied, leading them to bring the case before the United States Supreme Court in 1932. This proceeding, Powell v. Alabama, ruled that the boys were entitled to a retrial because of Alabama's failure to uphold its responsibility of providing the boys with qualified lawyers. Following this, the third trial of the case ensued, with one of the original accusers, Ruby Bates, returning to the courtroom for a different reason. Overwhelmed with guilt, she couldn't live knowing that innocent boys faced death due to her lies, and she admitted that she had fabricated the entire story. However, her honesty came at a cost. Many white Southerners turned against her, labeling her as a traitor. Despite her bravery, the jury, still influenced by racism, went on to irresponsibly sentence some Scottsboro boys to death. As the case dragged on, the constant trials and imprisonment began to affect the boys' mental health, with many expressing feelings of hopelessness and despair.
If I don't get free, I'd just rather they give me the electric chair and be dead out of my misery, because I sure don't want no time for something I haven't did.
Despite this, the ILD had no choice but to take the case to the United States Supreme Court once more to address Alabama's disregard of its 6th and 14th Amendment responsibilities. The 1935 case, Norris v. Alabama, granted the Scottsboro boys their 4th and final trial. Increased media attention had pressured the jury to act fairly, resulting in none of the boys receiving the death sentence. By the early 1940s, most Scottsboro boys were released or had reduced charges due to continued public pressure. However, this could never repay the more than 100 collective years they lost in prison, years stolen from their youth. Even after their release, the trauma continued to loom over their lives like a shadow.
Everywhere I go, it seems like Scottsboro is thrown up in my face. I don't believe I'll ever live it down.
It wasn't until decades later that the tragedy of the Scottsboro boys was finally acknowledged by Alabama Governor Robert Bentley, who posthumously pardoned the boys in 2013. This pardon highlighted Alabama's neglected responsibility of providing fair trials, but unfortunately none of the boys lived to witness this truly significant moment. However, the legacy of the Scottsboro boys case extends far beyond just the boys, as it still impacts Americans today. The case reshaped the justice system by establishing new legal protections that ensure the right to a fair trial. For example, Powell v. Alabama clarified that the government is responsible for providing not just any legal defense, but one that is qualified and effective, while Norris v. Alabama established the requirement for racially diverse jury selections. Despite these significant legal advancements, equality in court is still not fully guaranteed. This is evident in the case of the Central Park Five, a group primarily consisting of African-American teenagers who were wrongfully convicted of rape in 1989. The boys were interrogated for hours without their lawyers or parents, pressuring them into fabricating confessions and leading to their wrongful convictions. The case of the Central Park Five exposes the pattern of systemic racism in the judicial process. Today, African-Americans make up about 12% of the United States population, yet they represent 41% of those on death row. Because of this, many Americans are concerned about whether the legal system truly serves everyone equally, as in 2024, 51% of the population held an unfavorable view of the Supreme Court. As a result, Americans must take responsibility in fighting for a more equitable system, with the necessary first step being to actively protest these inequalities. However, this need for change was emphasized decades earlier by the Scottsboro boys case, which raised serious questions about the integrity of the judicial process. For the boys, their case was a fight for survival. However, its legacy stretches beyond just the boys' personal experiences. Instead, it left a lasting impact on the justice system, sparked numerous legal advancements, and ultimately became a true fight for a fair trial.